The Crimson Folder. What Princess Anne refused to tell Camilla. Something happened inside Buckingham Palace that was never supposed to become a public story. There was no shouting, no slammed door, no dramatic confrontation in front of cameras. Just 3 women, quiet corridor, and 1 crimson folder. Inside that folder was a decision that Camilla reportedly did not want Catherine to receive. But there was one problem. Princess Anne had already made up her mind. And when Camilla asked her for one final favor, Anne's answer was not an argument. It was silent, cold, complete. And according to the story, that silence told Camilla everything she needed to know, because Catherine was going through that door. The only question was why, and what exactly was written on the final page of that folder. Stay with me, because the answer changes the entire story. The morning everything changed. It reportedly happened on an ordinary weekday morning inside Buckingham Palace. No major ceremony, no waiting photographers, no press conference. The kind of morning where the public would have assumed absolutely nothing unusual was happening. But inside the palace, something very different was unfolding. Anne was there, Catherine was there, and a senior private secretary was reportedly nearby. Camilla was not supposed to be part of that particular movement, but she arrived anyway, and she did not come to stop Catherine permanently. That detail is important. She asked for a delay, just a delay. Her argument was that the timing was wrong. The king was dealing with health concerns, the country was watching his schedule, every public appearance was being analyzed, and suddenly, Catherine was about to walk into a room where she would receive information connected to the future operation of the monarchy. Camilla reportedly feared what people would see. Not preparation. Something much more uncomfortable. Replacement. That was the word hanging over the entire confrontation. Catherine's future was becoming more visible, and Camilla but Catherine herself apparently did not want this confrontation. She wasn't standing there demanding Camilla's position. She wasn't asking to become more powerful. She wasn't trying to embarrass the queen consort. She was simply waiting for the instruction she had been given. And Anne had already decided. Why Anne was different. To understand what happened next, you need to understand Princess Anne, because if this had been another member of the family, the story might have ended very different. Anne had nothing to gain. She was not competing with Catherine. She was not trying to move closer to the throne. She had no personal reason to remove Camilla from anything. Her reputation inside the royal family has always been closely connected with duty, work, service, institutional responsibility, and that made her extremely difficult to pressure. Because when Anne believed something was necessary for the crown, personal feelings became secondary. That was apparently what happened here. Camilla was thinking about the present. Catherine represented the future. Anne was thinking about what happened when the two collided. And then Anne reportedly said something that changed the atmosphere completely. The decision no longer belonged to Camilla. It belonged to the king. Charles had signed the instruction himself. Think about what that meant. Camilla wasn't arguing with Catherine, and she wasn't even arguing with Anne. She was effectively challenging a decision that had already come directly from Charles. And suddenly, the corridor became very quiet. But there was still something Camilla hadn't seen. The folder. The crimson folder. Anne was holding a crimson folder. It wasn't an ordinary briefing folder. According to the story, it contained formal paperwork relating to the new arrangement. Inside was the instruction that would give Catherine access to information she needed for future responsibility. But there was something else, a separate folder kept behind the main documents. And Camilla wanted to know what it said. She asked. Anne refused. No explanation, no reassurance, nothing. That was the moment Camilla reportedly became more concerned about the paper than the actual decision, because she already knew Catherine was going into the room. But what she didn't know was how far Charles had gone. What had he written? What had he ordered? And most importantly, what had he ordered specifically regarding her? That was the mystery inside the folder. And according to the narrative, Camilla was about to find out. But not yet, because the story had started weeks early. The pattern nobody wanted to see. The confrontation was apparently not caused by one isolated incident. Anne had allegedly begun noticing a pattern. Catherine's briefings were being delayed. Her responsibilities were being adjusted. Messages were being redirected. Certain meetings were suddenly placed under review. One incident could be dismissed. 2 could be coincidence. But eventually, the number of incidents becomes impossible to ignore. Anne reportedly started documenting, not through gossip, not through palace rumors, but as a timeline, dates, changes, instructions, what had happened, who had been involved, and where Catherine's responsibilities had suddenly been reduced. Catherine didn't fight back. This is one of the most interesting parts. Catherine reportedly didn't make a scene. She didn't challenge anyone publicly. She didn't demand an explanation. She simply accepted the revised arrangement. But Anne was watching, and she apparently noticed the humiliation because Anne understood something that Catherine may not have wanted to say out loud. There is a difference between sacrifice for duty and being deliberately reduced because someone else is afraid. Anne had spent decades accepting sacrifices for the crown. She knew what duty looked like. This didn't look like duty. It looked personal, and that was when she reportedly began asking questions. Who changed the instruction? Who approved it? And did Charles know? The answer was uncomfortable. Charles had apparently not approved the change. Then something else happened. A ceremonial arrangement was reportedly changed at the last moment. Catherine had expected to stand beside William. Instead, a new placement instruction appeared. She was moved back. Her position was changed, and a briefing she had expected to receive was reportedly reassigned. To everyone watching from outside, it might have looked like a tiny logistical adjustment, but inside the royal system, positions matter. Who stands beside whom matters. Who receives a briefing matters. Who is allowed into certain rooms matters. Every little detail can send a message, and Anne reportedly understood exactly what that message looked like. Catherine was being pushed backwards, and someone was making sure it looked official. Then William found something even more serious when William reportedly came across a confidential note. The note suggested that Catherine's important briefing should be postponed because of a supposed legal review. At first, it sounded legitimate. A legal review could justify a delay. The problem, according to the story, there was no legal review. No lawyer had been instructed. No official file existed. No process had been authorized by Charles. The review appeared to have been invented as a reason to buy time. That changed everything. Because there is a huge difference between saying, we need more time because the king has concerns, and saying, we cannot proceed because a legal process is underway. When that legal process doesn't exist, the second statement becomes something else. An excuse, a mechanism for interference. Now, there was paperwork, not rumors, not speculation, work. William reportedly did not take the matter straight to Charles. He took it to Anne, and that was probably the worst person for Camilla to have standing against her. Because Anne wasn't interested in winning a family argument. She wanted answers. Anne puts the papers on the table. Eventually, Anne reportedly confronted Camilla privately. No audience, no cameras, no palace performance. Just two women and a table covered with documents. The original schedule, the altered schedule, the changed placement, the delayed briefings, and the note about the legal review. Anne reportedly placed everything in front of Camilla. Then she asked one question. How many times had Catherine's duties been interfered with without Charles knowing? Camilla had an explanation. She was protecting the king. She was worried about his health. She believed Catherine's rise was moving too quickly. She feared the king was under too much pressure, and she worried that multiple centers of attention could weaken Charles at the exact moment he needed authority. On the surface, it sounded reasonable, but Anne reportedly had one problem with the explanation. If that was really the concern, why hadn't Camilla simply told Charles? Why were the changes happening quietly? Why were responsibilities being altered without his approval? And why had a legal review apparently been used when no such review existed? That was the difference. A disagreement can be legitimate, but a hidden intervention is something else. Anne reportedly told Camilla exactly that. Camilla's real fear. This is where the story becomes more complex, because Camilla wasn't necessarily afraid of Catherine herself. She was afraid of what Catherine represented, the future. For years, Camilla had fought to establish her position inside the monarchy. She had lived through enormous public hostility. She had endured comparisons. And eventually, she became queen consort. But now another reality was approaching. Catherine's future role was becoming more important. William was the heir. Catherine would one day stand beside him as queen, and the transition from one generation to another was no longer some distant concept. It was coming. Camilla could not stop time. She could not stop William becoming king, and she could not stop Catherine preparing for that future. But perhaps she could delay one briefing, one responsibility, one step, and that may have been the real purpose behind the request. Not to remove Catherine, just to slow down the inevitable. But Anne reportedly saw the danger, because institutions become unstable when personal fears start controlling official responsibilities, and that was something not tolerant. The decision Charles couldn't avoid. Eventually, the issue reached Charles, and this is where his own failure reportedly became impossible to ignore. He had tried to keep the peace. He had tried to reassure Camilla. He had tried not to create another conflict. But silence had allowed the problem to grow. Now he had to choose, not between two women, between two priorities: personal comfort and institutional preparation. The monarchy has systems designed for continuity. The public rarely thinks about them. Nobody wakes up thinking about who receives sensitive briefings if a monarch becomes temporarily unable to work. But when the king's health becomes a serious public concern, those questions suddenly become very real. Someone has to know what happens. Someone has to be prepared. Someone has to understand responsibilities before a crisis begins, not after. That was the argument behind Catherine's briefing. She was not being made queen. She wasn't being moved ahead in the succession. She wasn't being handed constitutional power. She was being prepared. And according to the story, William understood that perfectly. He reportedly told Charles that Catherine had never asked to take Camilla's place. She had never asked to become a symbol of Camilla's decline. But she couldn't serve the future monarchy if she was deliberately denied the information required to prepare for it. That argument reportedly forced Charles to act.
Charles picks up the pen. Charles reportedly sat with the crimson folder, and for a moment he hesitated because he knew exactly what the signature would mean. For Catherine, it meant preparation. For the institution, it meant continuity. But for Camilla, it would feel personal. After everything she had endured to reach her position, she would now be receiving an official decision from her husband that expanded Catherine's access to the inner workings of the monarchy. It would feel like the future arriving early. But Charles eventually signed. The instruction became effective immediately. No more delay, no more private attempts to postpone it, no more unofficial changes. And then came the second instruction, the one that made Anne's role so important. Anne was given authority to enforce not merely advise, not simply watch. Enforce. That meant that if someone tried to stop Catherine at the last moment, they weren't just going against Anne, they were going against Charles. And suddenly, the corridor scene made sense. Camilla had asked Anne for one final delay. Anne couldn't give it to her because Charles had already made the decision.
What was written on the last page? Now we finally return to the page Camilla wanted to see, the page that Anne refused to explain, the page that reportedly concerned Camilla directly. Its message was simple but powerful. Unauthorized interference with Catherine's duties had to stop immediately. Future changes involving her schedule, ceremonial role, or access to senior advisors could no longer be quietly manipulated. They needed proper authority. No private office could simply decide. No personal fear could override the king's instruction. No last-minute adjustment could be used to push Catherine backwards. And that is why the page mattered. It wasn't simply about Catherine. It was about Camilla's ability to influence what Catherine could and could not do. That influence was being restricted. King had drawn a line, and Anne had been placed on the other side of it.
The final moment. Now, imagine the corridor again. Camilla, Anne, Catherine, the crimson folder.
Camilla asks what is written on the final page. Anne says nothing. And that silence tells Camilla what words never could. The decision is finished. Catherine is going through the door. The briefing is happening, and nobody is going to stop it. Not because Catherine demanded it, not because Anne wanted power, not because Charles wanted to humiliate his wife, but because the future of the institution required preparation. And perhaps the most uncomfortable part for Camilla was this. The woman enforcing the decision had absolutely nothing to gain from it. Anne wasn't becoming queen. She wasn't taking Camilla's position. She wasn't moving Catherine ahead for personal reasons. She was simply enforcing what she believed was necessary. That is why her silence carried so much weight. And that is why the crimson folder became the symbol of the entire confrontation. One folder, one signature, one final page, and a decision that apparently made it impossible for personal fear to interfere with Catherine's preparation any longer. The palace had crossed a line. The future had been formally acknowledged. And Camilla was forced to confront something she may have spent months trying to delay. Catherine's rise wasn't a personal attack. It was the natural movement of the monarchy toward its next generation. And no one, not even the queen consort, could stop time. Because eventually, every royal family faces the same question. Will it protect the comfort of today or prepare for the reality of tomorrow? According to this story, Princess Anne chose tomorrow. And that is why the woman who would never be queen became the person who stood in the doorway and made sure the future walked through it.